The Septuagint was a very important writing in the Intertestament period. It is a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, which very few people could read, into Greek, which many people could read. Today we're going to talk about writings of the period. And I want to prove to you that the silent years, as the Intertestament period is sometimes known, is really not very silent at all. They were anything but silent. And I've got a whole plethora of books up here to show you as we go along, the Tosefta, the Talmud, the Mishnah, etc. As we go along, we'll talk about some of those things. All right, so today we're going to talk about writings of the period, as I mentioned. And these are the... Stand over here. Good grief. So these are the writings of the period. These are the order in the book. I do have a backup one. That's so wimpy. We won't use that one. So these are the order of the writings in the book that I have. If you have a book you've been keeping up, well, bad for you to read ahead because you read in the wrong order. Okay, I can't put this. Okay, I'll just put it over here. Thank you. All right, but I'm actually going to reverse these when we talk about those today. And there's a reason I'm doing that. I'm going to put the Mishnah and the Jewish writings all at the beginning, because all these things are just tangled in with each other and interrelated, okay? And I need to be sure and get to that today. I never know how much time I'm going to have when I teach a class. So I really want to get to that today and do one final wrap-up chart that shows how all these things are related, okay? And then, if we have time, we'll cover the Septuagint, the Apocrypha, and the Pseudepigrapha. Those are a little bit bigger subjects. I think we'll get to... we won't get to it all today, but we're going to try. All right. Now, the oral law, you remember that? It's also known as the tradition of the elders in Mark 7:3. And we see this in the New Testament when Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said," right? He is referring to, in almost every case, the oral law. Matthew 5:21-27. He kept talking about the Pharisees and that. If we could kind of add my parenthetical piece in here, it would be saying, like when Jesus said, "It may be stated, you have heard that it was said in the oral law, but I say to you from God's law." Okay? Much of the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees was because of the oral law. The Pharisees believed oral law was given out Mount Sinai with the regular law. Okay? At Mount Sinai. That was a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, for sure. Okay? Now, the oral law was truly the oral law back in Jesus' day. That oral law became a written oral law in the 200s AD, about between 200 and 220 AD, by a man named Judah the Prince, and his followers, 200 AD. So this oral law transformed into a written law called the Mishnah, which is this. This is the Mishnah. If you are a Jewish Bible student, you are a Mishnah student, okay? You study the Tanakh. We'll talk about the Tanakh in just a minute. And you study the Mishnah. You not only study the Mishnah, but you study the Talmud. Again, I'll talk to you how those things are related. All right. So the Mishnah is the written oral law. It's a compilation of Jewish thinking, rabbinic thinking, all the way back to the time of Esdras, about the end of the Old Testament, about 450 BC. And it's an attempt to answer questions not spelled out in the Hebrew scriptures. It's penned in the late form of Hebrew. Mishnaic Hebrew is called. Okay? It's ordered by topic, Sedarim, and subsections, tractates. The tractates are further divided into chapters and verses. All right. So these are the 6 topics of the Mishnah, the 6 Sedarim of the Mishnah. Agriculture, set feast, women, damages, hallowed things, purities. Okay? And then each one of those is divided into subsections. It's interesting, some of the sections in here, they have a whole section on sisters-in-law. I don't know why that is. It's kind of weird. I should read that sometimes. It's kind of weird. They have a whole section on sisters-in-law. They have a whole section on Sanhedrin. This is the Talmud of the Sanhedrin section, which contains the Mishnah and the Gemara. Stay tuned. That's going to make more sense here in just a minute. All right. Now, we've already studied some of these things. We already talked about feasts, right? Festivals, those kind of things a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whenever it was, okay? We already talked about measurements. When I showed you that picture of the temple that I drew in the book, okay, a lot of that information was from the Mishnah. The Mishnah states out very explicitly how much distance there was between the altar and the front porch of the temple, okay? where the molten sea was, those kind of things, okay? How everything was laid out in the courtyard of the priest, okay? All that came from the Mishnah. Specifically, it came from hallowed things, measurements. Midoff. That's actually Midoff, I think. Kodashim Midoff. All right. So we've seen some of these things already. Sanhedrin, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, okay? We'll talk about that some more in the trials of Jesus because, like I say, there's a lot of things in the Mishnah that spelled out certain illegal things the Sanhedrin did during these trials. Okay. All right. The Gemara, part number 2 of all these Jewish writings. Okay. The Gemara is a commentary on the Mishnah. Okay. Now, the Mishnah was an attempt to answer questions not spelled out in the Hebrew text. Well, that wasn't enough, so they had to come up with a commentary on the commentary. Okay, so the Gemara is this commentary on the Mishnah, a commentary on the oral law. It follows the same structure as the Mishnah. So if you go back to a Gemara, it looks like this, same structure. Okay, primarily written in Aramaic with some Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, compared to the Hebrew where the Mishnah was written. There are 2 Gemaras. There's a Jerusalem Gemara called Palestinian. Its final editing was in 425 AD, and there's a Babylonian Gemara. It's the more authoritative of the 2, and it's about 3 to 4 times bigger than the Jerusalem Gemara, and it encompasses a bunch of volumes. Let me do one more chart, and I'm going to show you my books over here. The combination of the Mishnah, the commentary, which is the more explaining of the Hebrew law, okay, and then the commentary, which is the Gemara, which is the commentary on the Mishnah, those 2 together are called the Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds. There's a Babylonian Talmud and a Jerusalem Talmud because there are 2 Gemaras. The Mishnah in both Talmuds is the same. It's just the Gemara is different. Does that make sense? Okay. Right here I have a commentary, or I have the Babylonian Talmud, one of 30 volumes, I think it is. Okay. This is just on the Sanhedrin. This is the Mishnah and the Gemara. This is the entire Mishnah without the Gemara. Okay. This is the Jerusalem Talmud on CD. I don't have it in volume form. Okay. It's much smaller, 3 to 4 times smaller than the Babylonian Talmud that I have a few volumes of. I have 6 volumes out of 30. I don't want them taking up my whole book space, for one thing. And plus, I didn't want to buy them. These were little extras from sets that were broken up, so I'd buy them here and there along the way. All right? Clear as mud, right? The Mishnah, oral law, the Gemara encompassed in the Talmuds with the Mishnah. All right. Everybody with me? All right. Get a couple of nods. Some of you are thinking, boy, I just can't wait for lunch. All right. So the Talmud is the combined, you've heard the Talmud, right, before? It's the combining of the Mishnah and the Gemara. You've heard probably the Mishnah and the Talmud terminology, but now you know what those are. All right. Again, there's 2 Talmuds, the Jerusalem Babylonian, where the Mishnah is the same in both. And both of these encompass Jewish rabbinic thinking from early Intertestament times to about AD 500. The most authoritative source of Judaism after the Hebrew Bible, and Jews have Talmud study, whereas we have Bible study. Now, if you think reading the Bible is kind of long, think about reading 30 volumes of this. It's really small print. This is a single section from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, one of 30 volumes. So the Jews do a lot of studying. All right. The Tosefta is another term. I have volume 1 here of 2 volumes, okay? It is also a commentary on the Mishnah. It's almost exactly like the Gemara. In fact, I had to look up. I said, what is the difference between the Tosefta and the Gemara? Well, there's not much. And these are the things, this is what my AI told me the differences are, okay? The Tosefta was written a little bit earlier than the Gemara, in the late 2nd or the early 3rd century AD. The language of the Tosefta is mainly Mishnaic Hebrew with some Aramaic, and the Gemara is mainly Aramaic with some Mishnaic Hebrew, okay? The purposes are pretty close to the same. The Tosefta is basically a parallel supplementary text, whereas the Gemara is a line-by-line discussion of the Mishnah. Their content is really similar to the same. And the Tosefta, even though an earlier work, is not considered nearly as authoritative as the Mishnah or the Gemara, but it's an important source from it. It's interesting, a lot of things from the Gemara came from the Tosefta. All right? So, we're adding to our terminology here. We've covered Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud, the grouping, Tosefta. All right. The Tanakh. Whew. We almost need to take a break and kind of digest what we've learned so far, don't we? We're not going to do that in this class. The Tanakh is simply the Hebrew Bible. The same as ours, 39 books. Okay? Same as ours. The same as the second definition of the Torah. We will talk about Torah in just a minute. You'll see what that definition is here in just a second. Tanakh is an acronym for the three parts of the Hebrew Bible. T stands for Torah, the 5 books of law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay? N stands for Nevi'im, the prophets. Those are 8 books. And K is for Ketuvim, the writings, 11 books. Can you add those up? How many are there? 5 plus 8 is 13, plus 11 is 24. Is that equal to 39? Oh, Denny, what is wrong with you? Have you lost your mind? You ask me that every Sunday. So this is how it works out. If I break out the Hebrew Bible compared to our Bible, ours looks like this. The Old Testament, okay? They don't have a New Testament. Theirs looks like this. They combine 1st and 2nd Samuel into a book called Shemuel, okay? They've combined 1st and 2nd Kings, Melachim, okay? They combine the 12 minor prophets that we have separated out in our Bible, okay? They combine Ezra and Nehemiah. We have those separate. And they combine 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So if they start out with 24, okay? We can add one here. 2nd Samuel is 25, 26. We can add 11 here. That's 37, okay? 38, 39. That's how we get 24 in the Hebrew Bible is the same as our 39 books of the Christian Bible. All right. The Torah, another term that you've probably heard of. But what is it? Okay. It has 3 different definitions depending on the context. First of all, in the most limited sense, Torah to the Jews means the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay. That's their most limited sense. If you see on the Temple Mount or at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, some people will be carrying Torahs around. You'll see Torahs in the big case things. These Torahs are generally the books of law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Okay, that is the most limited sense of Torah, but that is the most common definition of Torah to the Jews, those 5 books. A bigger definition is the Tanakh, T-N-K, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, okay? All right, the entire Hebrew Bible. In a more broad sense than that, Torah can encompass a lot of stuff, including the whole Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Gemara, which is the Talmud, okay, and even the Midrashim, which we've not covered yet. Yes, another term. I'm so happy there's another term. Another thing to learn, okay? All right. Now, before we get to Midrashim, let's talk about Targumim. And I like to call these Targums instead of Targumim. I don't like that term, but that's the plural term of that. Targum is the singular term. These are paraphrases, translations, free renderings, interpretations of Hebrew scripture and Aramaic and other languages such as Greek, Syrian, Chaldee, whatever. Okay, it's like the Message. Are you all familiar with this? Anybody have a copy of this? It is a paraphrase of the Bible. This just happens to be the New Testament version I bought a long time ago. So I can go read Romans, and it's a paraphrase of what Romans. It's an easy to read version of the Bible. Okay, but it's a paraphrase. It's a Targum. Got you? Everybody good? Smile and nod. Oral Targumim came soon after the Babylonian exile, and written Targumim came during the Christian era, okay, during the 1st century AD. An Aramaic Targum is referenced by a biblical writer in Ephesians 4:8, where it says, "Wherefore he said, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men." This is a reference to Psalm 68:18 from a Targum as opposed to from the Hebrew Bible. Okay, it's kind of interesting that there's a reference to a Targum in the New Testament in Ephesians 4:8. All right. Next up, the Midrashim. Midrashim are Jimmy sermons. If we were to take Jimmy's sermon today and transcribe that into a written work, that would be a Midrashim, or that would be a Midrash, okay, a single. If we took the works, all of his sermons, and compiled those into a written work, that would be the Midrashim, because those are synagogues, church But those were synagogue sermons to the Jews, written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. Okay? Broad interpretations of biblical text. Biblical folklore, written probably during the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Let me give you a couple of examples. Okay? The youth of Abraham. I really like these two examples. It's kind of cool. So one of the Targums, again, it's a synagogue sermon. So somebody just kind of making stuff up to prove a point. And one of these is the youth of Abraham. Abraham's father owned an idol shop. He's just making that up, I guess. I don't know if has that been true? I don't think that's true. But anyway, in this Midrash, Abraham's father owned an idol shop. And Abraham's father went out one day to run an errand, left Abraham in charge. And when his father came back, all the idols were smashed, except for one. Abraham smashed all the idols in the shop except for one, the biggest idol, and he gave that idol, he put a stick in his hand like this, so I can see this idol standing here like this. And his dad came in and said, "What happened?" And Abraham said, "I don't know. The big idol over there smashed all these other little idols." And Abraham's father said, "That can't happen." And Abraham said, "Exactly. It can't happen." Good point. That's kind of a cool sermon, right? Sermon number 2. Before Adam and Eve, there was Lilith. Adam and Lilith. That's based on a little something, a little bit weird. But anyway, in Genesis 1:27, it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." Okay? The story is that he created Lilith here. Okay? Adam didn't like Lilith. They didn't get along at all. And he complained to God. So, a little bit later on in Genesis 2:21, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. He slept, and he took one of his ribs and closed the flesh thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he woman and brought her unto the man. Thus Eve came about." Lilith first, created back in Genesis 1, and then Eve in Genesis chapter 2. Not making this stuff up. This really is a Midrash. It's a story. It's a sermon that someone came up with at the time. Okay, kind of interesting. All right. Now, we managed to scream through all these different texts, what they are. Okay, how do they relate to each other? Let's start out with a limited definition of the Torah. Okay, down here in the bottom, this is the most common definition. The Torah is the law. Those are what the scrolls are that you carry, that are being carried around by the Jews everywhere. Okay, that is definition 1, is the law. Definition number 2 is the Tanakh. Okay, the law, the prophets, and the writings. 39 equivalent books, but 24 to the Jews. Okay, that is definition number 2. Before we get to definition number 3, let's look at some other writings. The Talmud. There's a Jerusalem Talmud and a Babylonian Talmud, only because there's a Jerusalem Talmud, Gemara, and a Babylonian Gemara. Okay, the Mishnah is the same in both. Okay, so the Talmud is comprised of the Mishnah and the Gemara has a Babylonian and a Jerusalem equivalent. Okay, the Babylonian is the most common definition, though. That's the one the Jews really kind of hang their hat on. Okay, so that's the Talmud, and we also talked about the Midrashim. Okay, all right. So if you look at definition number 3 of the Torah, it includes the Talmud and the Midrashim. Okay? All right. Clear as mud, right? Those are the Jewish writings. Now, we finished that up. I'm glad. The Septuagint. Now we're translating into more Hebrew Christian, we base our Christianity on. Okay? All right. The Septuagint was a very important writing in the Intertestament period. It is a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, which very few people could read, into Greek, which many people could read. It's probably the most important literary work of this period. Okay, it was used and quoted by Jesus and the apostles. It was the Bible of their day. It was the Greek text of their day. Most of the references and quotes come from the Septuagint, with a few notable exceptions from Matthew, John, and 1 Corinthians that I will list down here. Okay. Traditionally, it has been promulgated that 72 skilled linguists did this translation from 284 to 247 BC, during Intertestament times, under the auspices of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. We've learned about him already, right? You remember him back in, oh my goodness, it's been a long time ago, chapter 3, 4, 4, 3, I don't know, somewhere back in there. The translation was likely completed by 132 BC, and then pieces of it were retranslated over the years. So this text existed at the time of Jesus and the apostles. This text is what they used. Pieces of it translated over the years. The book of Daniel was retranslated by Theodotion, okay, in AD 150, and this almost immediately replaced the original translation of Daniel. Aquila Sinope did some translation changes. Symmachus in the late 2nd century AD did some. Origen compiled a pretty cool work called the Hexapla between AD 234 and 245, and he put in it 6 parallel columns of text. The Hebrew transliterated into Greek characters, Aquila's Greek version, Symmachus's Greek version, a marked up copy of the Septuagint that he did, fixing errors and that kind of thing, and Theodotion's Greek version. And this marked up Greek version that he did became the de facto standard soon after its publication. Okay, but this was after the time of Jesus and the apostles. They had the original Septuagint, and not the one that was created by Origen later on in the 230s AD. Part 2. The Septuagint played a big part in the translation of Latin Vulgate by Jerome. He started work on that in AD 382. All of our books of our modern day Old Testament were in the Septuagint. Okay, some were combined in different orders, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings was combined into a book called Reigns with 4 parts. 1st and 2nd Chronicles were combined into one book, but basically it was our Old Testament that we have today. Okay, there were also several apocryphal books contained in the Septuagint at the time that Jesus would have had access to, and the apostles also. They appeared in different places in different manuscripts. In general, these are the common 12 of the most agreed upon 18 books of the Apocrypha. Okay, we're going to talk about the Apocrypha in just a minute. Tobit, Judith. If you look at the manuscripts, the Sinaiticus manuscript in the British Museum, the Alexandrius manuscript in the British Museum, the Vaticanus manuscript in the Vatican Library, all these manuscripts, all these ancient texts, okay, were contained in the Apocrypha, okay, and the Hebrew Bible. All right. And like I say, we're going to talk about the Apocrypha in just a minute and why we don't believe in the Protestants in general don't believe in the Apocrypha, yet Catholics do. We'll talk about why that is here in just a minute. All right, so that is the Septuagint. Now, 10 minutes to cover the Apocrypha. Can we do it? I see some nods. That's a go get them attitude. I like it. I appreciate that. All right, the Apocrypha. Now, there's different levels of acceptance of works. There's canonical works, the Bible, Scripture. You know, we hang our hat on that. There's apocryphal works that are less sure. Okay? Some people are sure, the Catholics are sure the Apocrypha is canonical, but we are not. Okay? Protestants in general are not on board with Apocrypha being canonical. And then there's pseudepigrapha works called false writings. We'll talk about those in just a minute, that are not considered canonical by anyone. All right, so the Apocrypha. Now, we're only going to talk about the Old Testament Apocrypha. There's a New Testament Apocrypha. They have a bunch of books like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of Peter, things like that. Those are New Testament Apocryphal books. Those are not relevant to us in our study of the Intertestament Apocryphal books, which were written during the Intertestament period. Okay? Apocryphon is the singular verb for Apocrypha. It means hidden or secret. The term was coined by Jerome, the author of the Latin Vulgate at the end of the 4th century AD. He discovered that these books were not part of any Hebrew manuscript he was using, although they were part of the Septuagint that he had available to him during his translation. So he included those in the Vulgate and generally included them in the Old Testament, but not separated out, okay, like the Catholics do. And I'll show you that in just a minute. I've got a Catholic Bible up here I'm going to show you, okay? The first translation to separate them out in separate sections between the Old and New Testament was the Coverdale's Bible of AD 1535. Most religious groups that consider Apocrypha canonical only accept 12 of the generally agreed upon 18 books. Now, there's some apocryphal books like 4th Maccabees, for example, that's not considered an apocryphal book by some people. It's considered a pure old pseudepigrapha book. Nobody considers it canonical, so it's really considered a pseudepigrapha. Okay, so that would take our list from 18 down to 17. I have here a Catholic Bible. I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but this contains 12 of the 18 apocryphal books. Even though if you go to the index, you'll only find 7. Oh dear. Denny, have you lost your mind again? Let's talk about that in just a minute. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. All right. So now, you'll only see 7 apocryphal books. In fact, we can pass this around or I'll put it up for everybody to look at. If you go and look, you'll see these 7 in the index. Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Book of Wisdom, the Book of Sirach, and Baruch. Okay? But I'm telling you that they have 12 in there. Why is that? Okay? So, these three, which we have separated out as apocryphal books, these are combined and interspersed throughout the book of Daniel. Bel and the Dragon, Susanna, the Prayer of Azariah, and the Song of the Three Jews. Okay, those apocryphal books are scattered throughout the canonical, to the Catholics, Bible of the Catholics. Okay, the additions to Esther are in Esther. They're actually chapters A through F in the regular book of Esther. You can read that in the Catholic Bible. Letter of Jeremiah is incorporated as the 6th chapter of Baruch, which is this book here. So that's how 7 books become 12 in this Catholic Bible. Okay? The Catholic canon was decided by the Council of Trent in AD 1546. It was declared there were going to be 73 canonical books of the Bible. Sometimes you'll see 72 listed because of combining Jeremiah and Lamentations in some cases, or Baruch and Jeremiah sometimes. So they have 46 books versus our 39 books of the Old Testament. The extra books that they have that we don't have are called deuterocanonical, or second listed, but they are considered canonical. They are considered actual scripture by Catholics. All right? And other religions too. I'm just kind of picking out Catholics particularly. So these are the 18 apocryphal books. These are the ones considered canonical by Catholics. Different combinations get you down from 12 down to 7, okay? And these are 6 of the books that fewer people consider canonical, but some do. The Russian Orthodox Church considers some of those canonical. The Greek Orthodox Church considers some of those canonical. We'll talk about that in just a minute. I was hesitant to put this chart in here because it's real confusing. If I look at Esdras, the apocryphal book of 1st and 2nd Esdras, they just rename things just wild and crazy, okay? Now, I'm going to tell you, don't sweat this. I promise you I won't quiz you on it. Maybe an extra bonus point or something. I don't know. When we have the test at the end of the quarter. Y'all scared? All right. So there's different designations of the Esdras books. When 1st and 2nd Esdras appear in a Catholic edition, they are always the same as Ezra and Nehemiah, okay? This Catholic version has Ezra and Nehemiah, but in some you'll see 1st and 2nd Esdras. Okay, Esdras is just the Greek form of Ezra, the Hebrew form of Ezra. Okay, 2nd Esdras, the apocryphal one, right here. Okay, is sometimes broken up even further. Okay, oh, there's the bell. So this 2nd Esdras is sometimes broken up into these. So if you look at the Latin Vulgate, it has 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Esdras is replaced with 4th, 5th, and 6th Esdras. Okay? Clear as mud, right? Again, I'm not quizzing you on this, so don't worry about it too much. Don't sweat the details. Just know that it's a mess. All right. Next up, 1st Esdras. Most of that book really does duplicate content from elsewhere. Okay? A lot of content from 2nd Chronicles and a lot from Ezra and some from Nehemiah. Okay? Except for 1st Ezra 3:1 through 5:6. And that's a pretty cool story that I'm going to tell you if I have a chance. Oh, I don't know if we'll get there or not. So, which translations have the Apocrypha? I mentioned the King James does. Okay, they have 15 of the 18 books. So if I look at translations prior to the King James versions, back in the old days, 1500s or whatever, okay, these are the versions that had the Apocrypha. Okay, you can see Dewey Reams, Geneva Bible, Bishop's, Taverner's, Great Bible, Matthew's Bible, etc. Okay, everybody had pretty much 12 of these, from Tobit down through 2nd Maccabees. Some of them had 1st and 2nd Esdras. Nobody had, is that true? Yeah, nobody had 3rd or 4th Maccabees, okay, and nobody had Psalm 151, okay? So this chart really is instructive to kind of look at a really high level, not look at the details, kind of look across the rows, okay? You see a lot of green there. You see a lot of people accepting 1 through 12, some accepting 13 and 14, whatever, okay? And you can kind of look down the columns to see specifically what version accepted what. Now, after the King James, this is what the Bibles look like, our more modern translations, all right? These are from King James all the way through the 3rd Millennial Bible, which includes them also. So all of them, again, include down through 2nd Maccabees. And then you have start getting some smatterings of things, 1st and 2nd Ezra, 3rd and 4th Maccabees, etc., okay, that don't have them. All right. Now, if you're writing a book like I did, Okay, and you have to look at all the apocryphal books. You basically have three different choices. Okay, you have the English version, revised version here. You have the New Revised Standard Version, and you have the Contemporary English version. Well, the English revised version I didn't want to use because it was pretty old, 1885. Okay, the language is a little bit more archaic. What I chose to use in all my writings and all my study and everything was the New Revised Standard Version. And I have several versions of that. I have a really nice version that has the Apocrypha in it. A translation in the New Revised Standard Version of the Apocrypha. I have a King James version of the Apocrypha. Actually, I have several King James versions of the Apocrypha. I have a King James version of the Apocrypha that was printed in 1614. I'll pass that around if you want to see it. If you have really dirty hands, if you got motor oil on your hands or something like that, don't look at that. So again, that's the 1614 version of the Apocrypha. So there's lots of different Apocryphas. The Apocrypha's acceptance, Protestants generally don't accept any of them, whereas Roman Catholics accept 1 through 12, as we mentioned before. Okay? Greek Orthodox accepts more. Russian Orthodox accepts everything except for 4th Maccabees. 4th Maccabees is just a wacko book. Actually, 3rd Maccabees has nothing to do with the Maccabees at all, and 4th Maccabees is really kind of parenthetical, kind of a little bit whack out there. 1st and 2nd Maccabees, 1st Maccabees particularly, is a really good, solid book. Okay, there's a lot of good history that's been verified with other sources in 1st Maccabees. Okay, but 3rd and 4th Maccabees, not so much. Catholics versus Protestants. Okay, the doctrine of purgatory is found in the Apocrypha, of which they say is canonical. So if you want to discuss with them the doctrine of purgatory, good luck, because that is canonical to them. That's found in 2nd Maccabees. Okay? We see that Judith, all these bodies of their fallen soldiers, they found that they had tokens and idols of Jamnia, and Judith prayed to God that their sin might be blotted out, and then they took up an offering for these guys, and he made atonement for the dead. This doctrine of purgatory, okay, this doctrine of taking up alms for the dead, is in their canon. You can't really argue with them on that, if they think that is their canon. In fact, the Council of Trent pronounced anathema on anyone who did not accept all 12 of these books. Anathema, that's bad. That's a curse. That's a ban. That's excommunication. That's denunciation. That's damnation. Wow. So, if you want to argue with them the doctrine of purgatory, good luck. I don't think you stand a chance to do that. All right. The history of the Apocrypha in English Bibles. The 1611 version of the King James Bible contained the Apocrypha as a separate section between the Old and New Testaments, as we discussed. It was a gradual removal over the years. From the mid to late 1600s, some English Bibles began appearing without the Apocrypha, especially among Puritan-influenced regions like colonial America. The Apocrypha moved from the 1769 version of the King James Version, the Oxford version. The British and American Bible Societies in the 1800s decided not to fund printing of Bibles that contained the Apocrypha. A pivotal moment was in 1826, when the British and Foreign Bible Society decided no longer print Bibles of the Apocrypha, and by 1885, the Apocrypha was basically omitted for Protestant Bibles, almost universal. Now, some of this was due to financial concerns because of printing extra pages for missionaries. Okay, printing was very expensive back then. Why don't we accept the Apocrypha? There's historical precedent. Okay, these books were never recognized by the Jews, who were the original recipients of the Old Testament. They were not included in the Tanakh. The Jewish canon was largely established by the 1st century AD and did not include the Apocrypha. They were written in Greek, not Hebrew and Aramaic, like the Old Testament. They're not quoted from by Jesus and the apostles. Even though they maybe allude to them, they're not used with the same authority of it is written. Okay? Whenever they say it is written, they're referring back to things in the Hebrew Old Testament. And many contain pretty gross historical inaccuracies. There are some canonical reasons we don't include those. Some church fathers like Augustine accepted them, others like Jerome did not, but he included them with lower authority. Protestants leaned on this uncertainty to exclude them. During the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther said, I don't think they're part of the canon, but I think they're good for reading, for useful and good to read. In response, because of the Reformation going on, the Catholic Church had the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent was basically an answer to the Reformation. And they said, what I just said, damnation on anyone who does not agree with these 12 books. Okay, anathema on these people who do not agree with these 12 books. And a lot of that is politics of Catholicism versus Protestantism. Okay, so there's some theological concerns with the books of the Apocrypha. Prayers for the dead, as we just mentioned. Alms for the dead, we just mentioned, also in Sirach. Salvation through works, we see in Tobit. Angelic intercession, the entire book of Tobit is angelic intercession and the use of magical practices in Tobit. They took fish, really kind of rotten, several weeks old fish innards and smeared on this guy, Tobit's eyes, to heal his eyes. Okay? Yeah, kind of gross. Anyway, kind of an interesting story. All right. Next week, I will tell you a couple of interesting, I'm not going to go through all of the 12 or 18. I've got synopses of all these in the book, but I'm not going to go through all of them next week. But next week, we'll cover like 3 or 4 stories, 5 stories, something like that I think are the more interesting stories. And there's some more interesting stories we won't cover, like Susanna. That's the first courtroom drama, was the book of Susanna and the Apocrypha. So anyway, we'll pick up there next week. I was hoping to get through it today, not quite there. So anyway, next week. So writings of the period. Last week, we talked about all the Jewish writings. And when we were done with that, I put up a chart that kind of showed how all these things kind of mix together and how they relate to each other. Okay. We talked about the Septuagint last week. We started talking about the Apocrypha, and we'll finish up the Apocrypha today, and we'll talk about the Pseudepigrapha very quickly. Now, so we talked about the Apocrypha, what it was, why we don't believe in it anymore. But today I'm going to tell you a couple of stories of the Apocrypha. And there's some pretty cool stories. Judith is kind of a neat story. She was a Jewish heroine. She was a widow. This is a good book to read if you want to go read an apocryphal story. She was a widow, and she was dressed in just kind of grungy, gross, sackclothy kind of clothes because she was sad about losing her husband. She was in the town of Bethulia, okay, when it was being besieged by the general Holofernes. Okay, Holofernes was the general of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Assyria. Oh, wait, what? Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. That's right. The book, Judith, says he was the king of Assyria. Okay, so that's one reason we don't trust some of these apocryphal books, is because they have some pretty blatant errors in there. Okay, so this Holofernes, the general of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Assyria / Babylon, whoever he was, okay, Holofernes was besieging Bethulia, where she lived. She took off her sackcloth and ashes, and the town was getting ready to fall. They were being besieged, and they were out of water, they were out of food, and they were getting ready to eat the first fruits, which was not allowed. Okay? So Judith said, I got to do something about this. So she dressed up. I call it, she dolled herself up. She put off her sackcloth. She put on nice clothes. She bathed. She put on perfume. She put on jewelry. And she made her way from Bethulia down the mountain into the camp. And she was caught right away. And all the men were saying, wow. And they took her to Holofernes. And Holofernes took her in and said, okay, we will feed you, everything. She said, nope, I brought my own food. And I only ask one thing. I will show you the way to defeat the Jews if you will let me just go out and pray every night. I need to pray to my God. And she said, the way to defeat the Jews is they're on the verge of eating the first fruits, and that is a violation of the commandment of God. Okay? If they do that, God will no longer be on their side, and they will fall. And Holofernes bought into this. Okay? So night after night, I think for 3 nights, Judith went out to pray. Okay? The guards at the door were kind of used to this, Judith going out to pray. Judith and her maid. Okay? On the 3rd night, I believe it was, Holofernes said, why don't you come to a great feast I prepared, and then afterwards I will make you like the Assyrian woman. You know what that means, right? Judith said, okay. So she went to the feast, and Holofernes got drunk as a skunk. And they came back to the tent, and he passed out. Oh, and he had a sword. Judith took the sword. He was lying there, and two whacks, chopped his head off. Very quietly, apparently, because no one heard. She put his head in a bag, carried it out the door past the guards with her maid, took off up the hill toward Bethulia. The next morning, Holofernes' army was getting ready to attack Bethulia, and they saw his head on a spike on the hill up there. That kind of made them a little nervous. They scattered everywhere. The Jews went out and just decimated them. Judith was a hero. But Judith is an apocryphal book. It's a pretty cool book, pretty interesting book, but it's apocryphal. Okay? If it were a real book, I think the Jews would have her more as a hero. They'd have maybe a holiday after her or something, like holiday with Esther and that kind of thing. Okay. Next up, additions to Esther. If you've not read the book of Esther in the Old Testament, it's kind of a neat book. But these are, I was showing last week in the Catholic Bible, that if you read a Catholic Bible, you'll see these chapters inserted as chapter A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay. So chapter A, in additions to Esther, was like a prologue to the canonical book of Esther. Okay. Chapter B was a letter sent by Ahasuerus to the Persians about the disobedience of the Jews. Remember the story of Haman and Mordecai? Okay. So Ahasuerus sent a letter out and said, Jews, you're bad. We're going to decimate you. We're going to kill all of you. Okay. He sent this letter out. Chapter C recounts a prayer by Mordecai and Esther. Chapter D tells of Esther's approach to the king. Going to a Persian king, no matter who you were, was fraught with danger. If he was in a bad mood, he could have you killed right there on the spot. Esther went into the king, and the king looked at her with a stern face, and she fainted. And he looked at her kindly again. He said, come on in. I won't kill you. Don't worry about it. Then she fainted again. But he let her tell the story of Mordecai, okay, and what was really happening. And Ahasuerus, in the canonical book, then lets the Jews defend themselves. In chapter E, we see a letter sent by Ahasuerus that the Jews could defend themselves. In chapter F, we see an epilogue to the book, which explains the prologue, which is a dream that Mordecai had, okay? Bel and the Dragon, another apocryphal book. Bel and the Dragon has to do with two stories. The story of Bel and the story of the dragon. Oh, y'all are so good. Y'all have read this, haven't you? The priests of Baal were liars. Babylonians are carrying their food to the temple of Baal and leave it there for the god Baal to eat. And Daniel said, They're not really doing that. Baal's not really doing that. He's not real. Daniel asked permission from the king. He said, let me prove to you that this is not real. And Daniel, unbeknownst to the priest of Baal, went in and scattered flour all over the floor in the temple. So Nebuchadnezzar closed up the doors of the temple and put his seal on there. And the next morning they went in and they saw all these footsteps in the flour. The priest had a hidden place under the altar in there. They would pop out, grab all the finest food, because the finest food was what they were given to Baal, right? And they would run around and they'd take the food and they would take it to their families. And all these priests and their families, they would just have a big, big meal every single night. And guess what? The king killed them all. And he had Daniel tear down the altar to Baal, the temple to Baal. There was also a dragon in this apocryphal book, hence the second part of the name, Bel and the Dragon. And Daniel, the people worship this dragon. Okay, whether it's a dragon or a serpent or what, we don't know, but it's called a dragon. So the people worship this dragon, and Daniel said, I'm going to kill this dragon without a weapon. And the king said, no, okay, let's see how you do that. Well, he mixed up this is so delicious, pitch, hair, and fat into a mixture and fed it to the dragon. And the dragon blew up after eating all this stuff. He killed the dragon without laying a weapon on him. Okay? Now, the people were not happy with this. He'd gotten rid of Baal and the priest. He'd gotten rid of the dragon. They didn't have anybody else to worship. And they threw him in, guess where? The lion's den. Kind of an apocryphal addition to what we know, right? Okay? And he was in there several days. He was hungry. So an angel went to Habakkuk, who happened to be in Judea. He said, I want you to go to Babylon and feed Daniel. And Habakkuk said, I don't know how to do that. I don't know where I've never been to Babylon. I don't know where the lion's den is. I don't know anything. So the angel grabbed Habakkuk by his hair and flew him over to the lion's den with his food, and Habakkuk went in and fed dying in the lion's den. And Daniel survived, and when he came out, the king took all the people who had thrown him in the lion's den and put them in the lion's den, and all of a sudden the lions were really hungry, and they ate them all up. That's the story of Bel and the dragon. First Esdras, chapter 3. Most of First Esdras is in other books. First and Second Chronicles, Ezra, other books, okay? The only additional story in there is in chapters 3:1 through 5:6. And let me tell you that. There were 3 bodyguards of the king, okay? The Persian king, Darius the First. It was a competition on their part to come up with what is the greatest thing. What is one thing that is the strongest and supports your answer. Okay? And this is the story of what these people came up with. The first guy said wine is the strongest thing. And my support is if people drink wine, then you, a peasant, become just as powerful as the king. The king gets taken down, the peasant gets risen up, and they're pretty much equal, right? Because everybody's drunk and nobody knows what's going on. So wine is a very powerful thing. The second guy said, the king is a very powerful thing. If the king says go and fight, if he says go and kill, if he says go and destroy, then you go and you kill and destroy and you bring back your stuff to who? The king. That's a pretty powerful person, right? The third guy, Zerubbabel, you know who he is, right? He's the guy that ended up going back to Jerusalem, rebuilding the city of Jerusalem, or the temple. Okay, he said women are the strongest thing. Had a pretty good argument. My wife is nodding her head. Yes, definitely the women are the strongest thing. And he said, let me read a verse to that in 1 Esdras 4:28 through 32. I can't tell this any better than he says it. Is not the king great in his power? Do not all lands fear to touch him? Yet I have seen him with a palmy, the king's concubine, the daughter of the illustrious Spartacus. She would sit at the king's right hand and take the crown from the king's head and put it on her own and slap the king with her left hand. At this, the king would gaze at her with mouth agape. If she smiles at him, he laughs. If she loses her temper with him, he flatters her so that she may be reconciled to him. Gentlemen, why are not women strong since they do such things? Pretty good argument. He also went on to talk about this is strong, but truth is stronger. Okay, there's a whole paragraph on truth is stronger. Zerubbabel won the argument, this competition between the 3, and he was granted the ability to go back and rebuild the temple. That's the Apocryphal book of First Esdras. There's some neat stories in here. Susanna's another neat book. It's the first trial. Daniel was a trial. He was kind of like the prosecutor and the defense at the same time. There was this woman, Susanna, accused of adultery, and he proved that because adultery is a bad thing for a woman, you get stoned, right? Okay, but some people had set her up. Okay, Daniel proved it was not her fault in the book of Susanna. That's a good one to go read also. All right. Now, so that's the Apocrypha. The Pseudepigrapha is one step down. We talked about the canonical books and then apocryphal books, and the pseudepigraphal books are kind of the bottom rung of the canonical ladder. Okay, pseudepigraphal are things that nobody really thinks are canonical. Okay, known as false writings. Pseudepigrapha means false name, false inscription, not accepted as canonical by anyone, as I mentioned. Written between 200 BC and 200 AD. There is little agreement in the literature how many exist, what their names are. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls added a whole bunch more pseudepigraphal books to our collection. I'm going to show you a list of 20 or so probably here in just a minute of some of the more popular pseudepigraphal books. Many of them are a rewriting of history in the language of prophecy, all of them under false names, under false authors. So the book of Jubilees, the claimed author was Moses. The book of 1st and 2nd Enoch, where the claimed author was Enoch. Okay, these are not the authors. They were just unknown Jews typically that were the authors. Some religious groups place 3rd Maccabees and 4th Maccabees, for example, as the pseudepigrapha, not part of the Apocrypha. 3rd and 4th Maccabees are just not very high quality at all. I mean, 3rd Maccabees has nothing to do with the Maccabees whatsoever. And 4th Maccabees is very peripheral. Okay. Interestingly enough, the New Testament book of Jude appears to quote 1st Enoch 1:9. In Jude 1:14 through 15, go home and read that today. That comes from the book of 1 Enoch, chapter 1, verse 9. Okay, and Enoch, also the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. And you can see the similar language down here in 1 Enoch 9. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the Pseudepigrapha. A quick list of the Pseudepigrapha. Now, these are all Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. There's also New Testament Pseudepigrapha. But we're just talking Old Testament, and these are all about Old Testament figures, okay, by the claimed author. Like Enoch is claimed to be the author of 1st and 2nd Enoch, but it really was an unknown Jew, and then I give kind of the date here, okay? So there's New Testament Pseudepigrapha also. I just remember one right off, like the history of Joseph the Carpenter. There's the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, and I'm getting maybe mixed up between Apocryphal and Pseudepigrapha books here. But anyway, there's a whole class of New Testament Pseudepigrapha and a whole class of Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. And this is just a partial list of what those are, okay? And this is kind of wrapping up our list. All right, that is chapter 13. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.